Welcome to One Way to Machines and the 8th Gen Honda Civic series. In this video, we will be doing the wheel stud process removal. Use a breaker bar and a 19mm socket to break the lug nuts loose on the ground, raise the car up on the air, and remove the wheel. If you have an automatic vehicle, make sure you put it in neutral before you start any work. If you have a manual transmission, the same thing. The reason is if the brake discs fall out when you push the brake pedal to put it in neutral later on in the job, you're going to have problems on your hands. If you are working on the front passenger side wheel, turn the steering wheel all the way to the right. If you are working on the front driver's side wheel, turn the wheel all the way to the left. This gives you more room to locate and work on the 17mm bolts to remove the caliper. It's important to note the bolts that you'd usually take out for the brake disc pad change are not the bolts we're taking out. We are not taking out these two bolts. Now we're going to zoom in and roll inside the caliper and show you where the two 17mm bolts are. Down here is one of the 17mm bolts, and just a little bit further up here is the second 17mm bolt. On the top bolt, the 17mm deep socket 1/2 inch helped to clear the back of the brake line, and the breaker bar was used on both of them. These bolts were not that tight on this car. After reviewing the clip, it was a little too zoomed in there to show you the benefit of using a 1/2 inch deep socket on the top 17mm. This here is the brake line, and this here is a banjo bolt. So as you can see, it clears the banjo bolt bar on the bolt. You do have clearance out here to the bumper in order to crack that top bolt loose. You see, here's the bumper. If you fold the breaker bar in, it can clear here. Now that you're ready to pry the caliper off, you want to make sure that you have your bungee nearby so that you can hang it off of the spring. Alright, so as you saw in that previous scene, the caliper gave me a bit of a fight. It'll be easier for you guys because you'll be directly in front of the wheel. I'm working off scene so that you can see it. It required a few taps from the hammer. If you do need to do that, make sure that you don't scathe the top of the hammer onto the actual brake disc surface. Now you can see I've moved the caliper gently to the opposite side, so it's towards the steering wheel right now. And I move the bungee up one rung there. The reason we do this is because in that original position, it's in our way. The access port is going to be down here for the bolt that we're working with. So you want to move the brake caliper to the back, being very mindful not to damage this sensitive line in the process. It's just a swinging motion for the caliper from here around to here. So our next few shots are going to be in this area. Alright, so here at the top and the bottom are those two 17mm caliper bolts that we removed. Right in between these two here on the dust shield, that's the access port for the wheel studs. So what we're going to do next from the outside is we're going to grab the rotor with both hands, jiggle it a little bit until you're able to align the back of the wheel stud you're trying to remove with the center of that access port there. This is where having the headlight and that small flashlight is going to come handy, as the back of those wheel studs is going to be all rusted and look like the rest of the brake disc. Alright, here we are at the back again. That's the back of the wheel stud that we want to remove. Now on the left here, this part here is going to give you some resistance, which is why I say you don't try to punch the wheel stud all the way through. You punch it out until it gets just about there, and then you're going to grab the brake disc with both hands while looking into the back of the brake disc with your face in the back, looking into this access hole. You're going to jiggle it around until you're able to loosen that bolt and use your finger in there until you can slowly slide it out. It's going to come out on a slight angle this way, but the wheel stud will pass inside of this area. For any task during this job where you use the hammer, it's important not to grab the hammer by the bottom. Always grab the hammer right up here for the maximum in control so that you don't hit other things. Knock the desired wheel stud down to the surface face of the brake disc here using the hammer. The bolt is loose enough. Alright, so here we are at the front. Now we're going to roll on into the inside here. That's the other end of the bolt. Just to loosen it up a bit there. And there it is. I just kept a little bit of pressure on the back with my finger as I rocked the brake disc, and it popped loose there. If you don't have a camera in your hand, you can probably just pry it out. I'll have to grab something here a little bit just to keep it all in one shot so that you guys can see that it can be done. And there you go. No cutting, nothing required, and it came out. In the rare case that you have bulging threads on your wheel stud to the point where you can't get it out from the back of the dust shield, you'll want to push it back in, and then from the outside use a 4.5-inch grinder with a grinding wheel and grind down the threads that are bulging and then pop it back out. Make sure to use safety glasses. When you install a new one, place it in. You'll hear a little clip and then it'll jump in to the dust shield. Here's this new wheel stud. You want to make sure it's the same height before you go to install. Place the open-ended 19mm nut onto the new wheel stud, thread it in, and then use either the breaker bar or a 1/2-inch ratchet. Check with your small flashlight in the back here to make sure that it's seated through the access hole. I'm going to use a 19mm on a 1/2-inch ratchet. Now for the final tighten using the breaker bar. So the breaker bar is on right now. As you can see, if you struggle a little bit with getting the last bit of the stud head to fully seat, you want to grab inside of here, which is inside that access hole, and the brake disc with your whole hand, and then you want to stand up a little bit, and that way you can grip the brake disc with just enough force to counteract the actual motion in order to fully seat it. I recommend against putting the car in park or in gear because that'll have some awkward motion. Just do it this way and you'll be just fine. Once you've fully seated it, use the breaker bar to remove the 19mm nut and begin your reinstall process. And there you have a fully seated wheel stud. In the case that you're not able to snug the wheel stud and seat it by just holding the brake disc, if you have an automatic, before you put it into park, reinstall the brake caliper, then put it into park and use the breaker bar to snug it down. If you have a manual, just pop it into first gear. And also if you have an impact gun, you can use that as well. In the case that you do put the caliper on, you're going to want to verify from outside that the wheel stud has fully seated, as you cannot see into the back of the brake disc anymore. And you can use something like a straight paint stick, a solid piece of metal, or even just a small level to go around and make sure that everything is flush. In regards to the two 17mm bolts that hold the caliper in place, snug them down all the way until you feel the bolt bottom out, and then give your maximum body force for about 2 to 3 seconds. If you want to, you can consult the repair manual for the actual torque spec. If you're working on an older car like this one, on reinstall, get the brake caliper in by hand at first. Make sure it's aligned onto the brake disc. And then if you need to, you can give it a couple little taps on the top and the bottom to get it in until you can visibly see that the holes for the bolts in the back have aligned. Spray a little brake clean on the threads and clean it up with a rag. I looked into the holes and there was a small amount of rust dust that was sitting inside of the female ended threads for these bolts. So you want to make sure, even just with your mouth, just give it a light blow. For these 18mm bolts, always make sure to snug them in by hand before you get on them with any kind of a socket. It can also be quite easy to forget your bungee if it's black colored, to leave it in the wheel well, and then you'll wonder what that sound is, so make sure you remove that too.